Good evening to all of you guys. This is my second video for my YouTube channel, and we're going to talk about how were the enslaved Africans controlled in the British Caribbean, and it's about revolts and resistance form 4. To you guys, form 4. And I'm going to repeat some stuff, and the topic of this video is the ways there were slave laws, and these slave laws were a way of controlling the slaves in the Caribbean. And we're going to talk about this more in this video of about 10 minutes. Some about repeating. History as an approach. So I told you guys already, the why question is very important, a very historical question. And the question here is, why do humans make certain choices and not others? Yeah, why do humans make certain choices and not others? It's a very important historical question. I'm going to ask that from time to time, also in dealing with the slave time in the Caribbean, and also in our topic about how were the slaves controlled by the European colonizers. Okay. We also talked about this. There is a complex master-slave relationship. That means that it's just not like this in this picture, where the slaves were controlled. It is much more complex than this. Yeah? So the European colonizers would have wanted that it was like this. A colonizer walking around, the slaves doing their jobs, with corn or with cotton or with sugar, a lot of the times in the Caribbean, but it was much more complex than that. And there are a few reasons for that. Yeah? We talked about that they were outnumbered, for instance, the European colonizers, so it has to be more complex. And also a question that we talked about last video clip was, if it was so easy, why didn't all slaves in the Caribbean rise up? And there were different reasons for that. There were different ethnic groups from Nigeria, from Ghana, from the Congo, from Angola. Second, they didn't have access to weapons. And third, they were psychologically cowed, what actually means they were being intimidated, also humiliated, but the intimidation is more important. It's like they were being kept small, if you could say. Yeah, they were like, their identity was taken from them. They got another name. They could not practice their own religion. So they were psychologically cowed, a typical British word. Okay, and he also talked about if there were more Africans and Europeans, the white dots are the Africans, and the colored ones the Europeans in this image. If there were more Africans or Europeans, how did the Europeans control the Africans? Well, they used, for instance, alliances with mixed and free black groups. Example, in Jamaica, the mixed and free black groups got privilege, very important word, and that privilege was they got free property. And that free property means they got privileges. Now we're going to talk about the next way in which people in the Caribbean, the Europeans in the Caribbean, controlled the slaves, and those are the slave laws in the Caribbean. And important to keep in mind, and I will return to this every time, is what the law says is not what always was done. So the law says one thing, and what you see in the Caribbean islands, the French, the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, was a whole different thing. A lot of the times. Not always, but a lot of the times this was the case. For instance, you have the siete partidas. Yeah, and it was from the Middle Ages, if you know that term, from 13th century in Spain. Yeah, in Spain you had the Catholic Church, and they want all people in Spain to be Catholic. And there were Muslims in Spain, and there were Jews in Spain, and in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, because of the siete partidas, they wanted everyone to be Catholic, and they want everybody to prove that they were of Spanish descent, Spanish European. Yeah, so it was aimed at that. The Spanish church wanted everybody to be Catholic, as you can see in this image. That was very important in those days, and everybody had to be of the Spanish line to have more privileges in society. And these siete partidas was also used in the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and in South America to achieve this. Yeah, so it was written for Moors, that was actually Muslims from North Africa, and Jews that had to adapt themselves to the Catholic faith and have to show that they were pure Spanish people. Then we also have, there are much more slave codes, but we will take two, and later on a French one, that was the Barbados slave code. The funny thing is that the British did not use slaves in the beginning to work on the plantations, the sugar plantations, but they used indentured servants. Some people, prisoners from Great Britain, but people also were just plucked from the street. They got people from the street that had to work on plantations. So in the beginning, indentured servants, it means te werk gesteld. They were forced to work. Yeah. And we had the Barbados slave code for this. What were the main differences between slave laws, if we look at them? First, the Spanish laws, the siete partidas, were meant for the Catholic faith that they had to have, and intermarriage, that we can see here. Second, the British laws were about different things, namely about property and about trade, about the commercial activities that the slaves could or could not do outside of the British laws. Very important. Okay. If we look at the slave laws, it's important to ask the following question. Why did planters worry so much about escaped slaves? Because in the slave laws, there's written a lot about how to deal with slaves that escape from the plantations. And why did planters worry so much about this? There are multiple reasons for this. First, when a slave escaped, this slave or these slaves undermined the plantation system. And with undermine, I mean ondermijnen, is a significa a plantation system not a trahabon. Each slave that escaped was like a piece of an influence on the plantation slave, plantation system, not working correctly. And that was, of course, a problem. Second, often it came to pass that an escaped slave or a group of escaped slaves attacked the planters and their property. And of course, this was a problem for the planters. And third, his workforce, his forza di trabalho, was reduced. Zijn werkkrachten were reduced, and he had less people that could work on his plantation, his forza di trabalho. And of course, that was not good for the planter. That was not good for the planters. And three, we've got now. And fourth all three things I named above and here led to that the planters lived in constant fear of conspiring slaves. Yeah, conspiring means conspira. So when the slaves escaped, the planters did not know what they were doing or conspiring, so perhaps they could even come back in bigger numbers and attack the plantation. And the planter lived in constant fear of this, what escaped slaves could do when they came back. So that's why the planter was constantly thinking about how can I get my slaves back? How can I make sure that the slaves do not form a threat or a danger to my operations on my plantation? Another example of a slave act of the British, the New Barbados Slave Act, an extension. So after 10 years or so, the Slave Act of Barbados was extended. More acts, more parts of the law were written. For instance, and this is important, one part of the Slave Act was that the slaves could not play the drum. Because with the drum, you can communicate over greater distances. And perhaps, I just talked about conspiring slaves, they could conspire together in this manner. In the New Barbados 1676, there were punishments that the slaves could get, flogging or even executions. Also, how to deal with slave assaults on whites. You could get executions for this. And also, theft, how to deal with slaves who still stole from their former plantation. And one of the main goals for this extension was to restrain wanderings and meetings of slaves. So the slaves, we see they stole, else they wouldn't make a law for this. They assaulted whites, and also they wandered outside of the plantations, they met together, and one of the purposes of this extension of the Barbados law was to prevent all of these things and to give the planter, the plantation owner, an instrument how to deal with these things. And as I said before, the drumming, it was also something you could get punished for as a slave. And perhaps you think, why was drumming important? It was seen as an act of their own culture, as a way of expressing their culture. And this culture was like, you have to be psychologically cowed, as I before said. It has to be put down, humiliated, intimidated. And also, the drumming, as I said, could be a way of communicating over greater distances. The French slave laws. I said I will talk about a third slave law, and this is the Code Noir. That is French for the black law. In the French slave laws, there were no property allowed, so the slaves could not have any property. If they did certain stuff like attacking the plantation owner or escaping, execution was allowed. And also here we see there could not be any group gatherings. Perhaps they could conspire against the planter. So we see also the same things coming back, also in the Code Noir. When we look at the slave laws of the Caribbean, we've said before, what the specific law says is not what always was done. So the law is this thing, but what we see happening, what we know that happened on the Caribbean islands in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, is a different thing. A whole thing altogether. So we have these two things, and we're going to look at how did the planters work with the slave laws, and what do we know from the records and diaries that really happened. Well, in the Code Noir, the master had different responsibilities. For instance, the slaves had the right to file complaints with the master, and the master had to listen to them and perhaps even bring improvements to his treatment of the slaves if he thought so that this was correct. They also had to be baptized. They had to be made Christian. I mean by this, baptisamento, or in Dutch, the doop. So they had to become Christian. And they had to have a possibility of buying their freedom. So in their lives as slaves, there had to be some possibility to earn money, and there had to be some possibility to earn their freedom. Torture was in the Code Noir banned, although there were possibilities for executions, but it was a ban of torture. Now we're going to look at what really happened and what really expired at the islands of the Caribbean, what we know of. Why didn't planters always abide to the slave laws? One, messages between the Caribbean and Europe. You see a map, Canada, USA, the Caribbean, Cuba, Haiti, a part of Belize. We see the great distance between the Caribbean at one side and Europe at the other side. This was thousands of miles, and back then there were no airplanes, was no internet, so communications were very difficult. So sometimes the king of Spain, for instance, or the king of Britain could say one thing, but when it would arrive at the Caribbean, the situation would have drastically changed or totally changed. So that it was very difficult. Second, it depended on what the local officials would do. Were they bribed? Were they friends with the planters? Did they have their own opinion about how slaves should be treated? So local officials means the king or the government in Europe had ambtenaren or public servants who worked for the king or the European government. But because of the distance between Europe and the Caribbean, the local officials had a strong independence of what they could do in the Caribbean. So they're dependent on local officials. And on this map, you can see the great distance between Europe and the Caribbean. So this gave the local officials a lot of movement space to make decisions on their own, be bribed, or have their own opinions how to interpret, how to work with the laws that came often from Europe. In British cases were made on the islands themselves, but still there was a lot of space of working around the laws or being very strict with the laws if the local officials wanted this. Okay, to which degrees did planters and others' rights abide by these codes? We don't know a lot what expired, yeah, but we do know the following things of these kinds of documents, official records. There were high death rates, yeah, the mortalidad, de impapimento. Yeah, that means a lot of people died at the plantations, on the British, on the French plantations, Spanish plantations, the Dutch plantations. Mortalidad, the death rate, was very high. And we know this from official documents looking like these. Most records were written by the Europeans, and most records show that the slaves were treated according to the law. So the planters, or the shons, like we call them in the former Dutch Caribbean, must have had the idea that they in either case, they should pretend to listen to the slave laws. That was important to them. So they were of influence and they were important. And third, the slaves sometimes got their freedom. Yeah, they could buy themselves free. This was the case. There were free slaves. We have instances in which they could trade, even when that was not allowed in the Siete Partidas or the Code Noir or the Barbados slave laws. Yeah. And besides working as a slave for planters, we know of situations, a lot of situations, where besides their slave work, the slaves could put themselves for hire. Yeah. And we see that for better or for worse, the situations on the islands were very different from what the slave laws prescribed. British, Spanish, French, Dutch slave laws. It was the real situation on the island was very different from the slave laws. They had a certain influence on how the slaves were treated, but the real situation was different. That we know for sure. But the slave laws were in the core made to deny rights and humanity of the slaves. And a justification of enslavement, justification, identification is the key, is like being Christian, being a modern European, where science was very important and philosophy and reasoning. What was the way slavery was justified? Yeah? There are different ways of justification. One is that some philosophers and thinkers from Europe said these people have a barbarous nature, and that's why we can enslave these people. They are different from us. Altering them, we also call it. And because a lot of thinkers and philosophers from Europe and writers said these people are different from us, they have a barbarous nature. This is also written in the Barbados Slave Act from 1661 and the later one from 1676. It says these people have a barbarous nature. In other words, they are different from us. This makes that we have the right to enslave them. We call this a justification, the why of our behavior. And to show these otherness, to show that they're different, we even read about a lot of cases of torture and execution. And even some slave owners have written this down. Not all of them, most abided by the law and didn't show these in diaries or official documents. But we have a few examples of where planters just wrote it down what they did with their slaves in official documents and in diaries. For instance, mutilations, torture, and death. We have records of this. This record above is a diary of a British man, Bob Thistlewood, and this Bob Thistlewood is a British planter, and this British planter, actually a manager working for a planter who lived probably in Britain, wrote down the slaves' treatment and how he tortured them, how he whipped them, how he mistreated the slaves, literally, and he wrote it down in his diary. Yeah? And even this French planter, Lejeune, he was really, when we read it now, an awful man. He wrote explicitly what he did with his slaves, how he whipped them, how he tortured them, how he let them executed. So these two examples, a French one and a British one, show that not every planter had the feeling that they had to pretend. They both probably had the feeling that this was a normal way of dealing with the slaves. And it shows that mutilations, torture, and death did happen. And this was also a physical way of psychologically cowing, intimidating, humiliating the slaves. And this is this Bob Thistlewood, and next to that are examples of the documents in which he describes, as a manager working for a planter, a British one, how he treated the slaves. But not all slaves were mistreated, not because of humanity or something, but because they needed workers on the plantations. They needed their property. So if by an invalid reason the slaves were killed, the manager or the planter was not sued for murder. He was sued for destroying property. Until the 1830s of the 19th century, that was changed. But most of the colonial era in the Caribbean, if you killed a slave, you were not prosecuted because you killed a person. You were prosecuted because you destroyed property. And this is a way that most slaves, if they worked properly and if they behaved in a certain manner, that the planter could agree with, a way that he could make money off the slave. They were probably most of the time treated properly. Yeah, properly is like a relative word, of course. They were tortured, they were punished, whipped, but most of the time not killed, because not about humanism or niceness, but because they needed the property, they needed their slaves to work at their cotton, sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, and to make profit for them. You do not destroy your investment to make money. With these words, I end this clip. I hope it was informative for you. If you have questions, you can put them down below. And I will make a third video clip about the way the planters and the European colonizers controlled the slaves, and that this will be about ideological justification. What ideas supported the controlling of the slaves? This will be my third video about this subject. Questions here or in class, or for instance in Google Class.